Hello? Hi. Hi. My name is Ray Duckler, and I'm the columnist at the Concord Monitor. And I was asked to be the moderator for tonight. And just to start with, I've never done this before, so I'm nervous. So hopefully you'll cut me some slack. The second thing is, my part in this was, after this movie ended, is when New Hampshire's Attorney General took over and began investigating what the office suspected might be happening here. And so we picked it up, the Attorney General's office then picked it up at that point, and we ended up finding out that basically the same thing that happened in Boston had also happened here. And then it spread, as you know, throughout the country, but we were on the ground floor of this. And I just want to start out by saying, I want to introduce, these people are going to introduce themselves, but I do want to point out that Jim Rosenberg is over here, and he was one of the investigators with the Attorney General's office, and he did a lot of digging, and he's really one of the people responsible for uncovering what was going on here. And I also wanted to introduce Dave Ouellette is all the way on the end there, and he is a survivor, and he came forward and spoke to me in detail. And I was going to say he deserves a hand, and so I did want to point them out. And now we can go down the row here, and each person can say who they are and what their connection is to this story and how it connects to New Hampshire. Starting with right over here, to Geoff Forester.
Hi, I'm Geoff Forester, and I'm the photo editor at the Concord Monitor.
Hello.
Yeah. And from 1995 to 2002, I was on the picture desk of the Boston Globe. And I worked very closely with Robbie, Walter Robinson.
It's working, you just have to put it real close to your mouth.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? So for 3 years, Walter Robinson was the head of the Metro Department, and as was explained in the movie. And Sasha Pfeiffer was a staff writer at the time before she went into Spotlight. And because I was on the picture desk, I worked with a lot of reporters, so I got to know both of them very well. And it's a remarkable portrayal of what you saw tonight. Rachel McAdams just nailed it. Her mannerisms, I think the word that you can describe Sasha Pfeiffer is earnest. She is a very earnest person, and that came through. And I think it helped in her reporting and to get the victims to trust her and to come out and tell their stories. Remarkable portrayal. Michael Keaton must have spent a lot of time with Walter Robinson. The mannerisms, it just was uncanny. So I've seen this movie before, and it's a great story and a great acting. I always want to say Leif Schreiber as Marty Barron. I worked with Marty for a couple of years. The last couple of years I was there, and that was one of the best portrayals as well. I mean, just the non-affect, not suffering fools at all about anything was just uncanny. That's the word. The only one slight criticism I have is the portrayal of Steve Kirchen. He was sort of the annoying guy in the background asking questions, and that's not the Steve Kirchen I knew. In fact, he was part of the Spotlight team. He joined later and was instrumental. And the man has 3 Pulitzers to his name, so I thought that was an unfair portrayal, but overall, the movie was phenomenal. And during Oscar time, when you see Rachel McAdams walking on the red carpet, you will see Sasha Pfeiffer right along with her, because I think they've become very good friends and the Golden Globes, you saw her walking down the red carpet. So I'll just leave it there and I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you. My name is Jim Rosenberg. Currently, I am a lawyer at Shaheen Gordon here in Concord. But from 2000 to 2004, I served in a post as the Assistant Attorney General and was one of the two prosecutors tasked to the investigation and the ultimate prosecution of the Diocese of Manchester for its failure to manage sexually abusive clergy, and ultimately secured in the agreement with the Diocese of Manchester its admission that it had committed the crime of endangering the welfare of children. There's something wrong about the fact that I'm the spokesperson here tonight for the prosecution of the case, because I did the case under the direction of the Attorney General at the time, whose name was Phil McLaughlin, and who was a person who, with incredible zeal and energy, insisted on putting together an investigative staff led by two prosecutors. The other prosecutor is Will Duckler. Will's a judge now, and because he's a judge, can't comment publicly on things, but he's here. So he'll tell me afterwards what I've done and said wrong. I was 27 or 28 at the time that the prosecution of the Diocese of Manchester and Concord occurred. And at the time, I was Teflon. The Attorney General told Will and I to prosecute the case, and for the better part of a year we put our heads down and did. It did not upset me at all, not for 1 second. That's not quite true. There were some emotional moments. But as this movie came out and Ray Duckler revisited the story of how the state of New Hampshire tended to the crisis in the Catholic Church, I wasn't Teflon anymore about it. I don't know why it bothers me so much now, so much more now than it did then, but it does. I think it's probably because I'm a parent, and you look back on some of the stories and think much differently about them as an adult, because I was a kid, quite frankly, in the prosecution then. What was incredible about the case in the prosecution in New Hampshire is that the state of New Hampshire, as you all know well, is broken in that it has no resources to pay for anything. The prosecution in this case wasn't any different. The Attorney General at the time asked for investigative resources, and people donated them. The Attorney General's office donated an investigator named Tony Fowler, who's a retired Manchester Police Department. The Manchester Police Department, who the investigation was very important to for some reason, donated a police officer for the better part of the year to join our investigative team. So did the Stratford County Sheriff's Department, the New Hampshire State Police, and others too will remember who they are, and I can't. The case proceeded from there. The hard part was we pursued not individual priests, we pursued the diocese as an entity for its institutional failure to protect kids from abusive clergy that it knew about. That concept in criminal law is fairly novel. Typically, when you think about the prosecution of criminal cases, you think about the prosecution of an individual for a crime. That individual human being for their wrong can be put in jail. When you prosecute an institutional entity for its collective wrongdoing over the course of years, that institution, that corporate soul, can't be put in jail. So the question was what we were going to seek to accomplish by trying to hold the diocese itself responsible for a crime. The next problem was these events, as the movie responsibly pointed out, occurred in most instances an enormous number of years ago. And at the end of the day, a prosecution for a misdemeanor of child endangerment, for knowing that a priest had committed a wrong, and then reassigning that priest, ultimately to know that that priest perpetrated a new offense in a different parish against another unsuspecting victim. That child, the downstream victim, was the endangered child. The statute of limitations on a misdemeanor is 1 year. So that meant that at first blush, the prosecution of the diocese as an entity was legally impossible to do until we figured out a legal theory to get around it. And in sum, it was this. There is, in the statute of limitations, an exception to that 1 year rule when an element of the criminal offense is the breach of a fiduciary duty, the breach of a duty of care you owe to somebody. And there's a discovery provision in the statute of limitations that allows you to trigger the beginning of that year, not when the conduct occurred, but when you discovered the conduct occurred. Our argument essentially became that our discovery occurred when they printed their newspaper article. There's a little bit more to it than that, but in this most simplest form, that's when we claim the discovery that the diocese breached its duty of care occurred, giving us a year from February 2002 or whenever they printed, or so. There was more to it. The Attorney General placed a call to the diocese. In the first call, they said we didn't have the same problem here that they had there. In a follow-up call, they acknowledged they weren't quite accurate in the first call. That's what triggered our year, really. But it all gets the ball rolling with this article. So we believed a year. The investigation went on from there. In the context of the investigation, a couple of abusive clergy flipped and participated, submitting to Attorney General conducted interviews that Will and I took part in. And in those interviews, they described various victims of theirs, as well as the way the diocese had handled them and managed them throughout time, including sending them to therapeutic places like the ones we saw referred to just now in the movie. And from those interviews, we secured new victim names. And then we went out to speak with the victims themselves, because if they were later victims, if there was proof the diocese knew something, and then a victim after that, that was our potential victim in what we intended to be an indictment against the church itself, not one individual. And so I had an experience, and then I'll pass the microphone on, similar to the one we just saw in the movie, where the reporter went to speak with a victim who went to BC High School, and he essentially said to the reporter, "How'd you get to me?" During one of the priest interviews, the priest identified a victim. I think it was in the city of Berlin. We reverse engineered that, wanting that victim, because it was a downstream victim. It was after the priest had been reassigned by the diocese from someplace else to Berlin, and I can't remember the specific detail of that. So Tony Fowler and I drove to Maine. We found the victim teaching at a prominent college in Maine. And when we got there, he said, "How did you find me?" And we described the process I just shared with you, and we asked him to speak with us, and he said, "Not before I talk to my wife." So pretty powerful then, and it reminded me of that in the movie. So it was an amazing case to be part of, and I'm pleased. I hadn't personally revisited the case or these issues, I don't think, other than passing conversations with the judge since 2002 and until Ray asked to talk to us. So I'm glad that he did, and I hadn't seen the movie till tonight, so I saw it for the first time with all you. So with that said, thanks. I'm curious to hear your questions. I'll pass the microphone on. And thanks to some friendly faces that are here. Sally and Doug, it's good to see you. It's been a long time. Mr. and Mrs. Sims, good to see you too. So it's really nice that I get to grow up and work professionally and then take part in events in a town like this one, because everywhere I go and everything you do, there's a lot of friendly and supportive faces. So thanks.
And thank you for what you do. Good evening, my name is Betsy Clague. I'm an attorney from Massachusetts. I've been in practice since 1996. I have a private practice in which I represent survivors of a variety of kinds of abuse, including sexual assault perpetrated by and on behalf of institutions, individuals, family members. I also represent some agencies, including a child advocacy center and several agencies who provide services to survivors of sexual assault. And I represent them in instances when the accused will go into court trying to get the private therapy records of survivors and victims. And the reason I do it, and the reason I do it pro bono, is because one thing that we know, and that we've known for a long time, is that those who have been through this horrible, horrible victimization have the best chance at first survival and eventual healing when they get real clinical help that is privileged, that is private, that is confidential. So you heard a lot about you heard a little bit about confidentiality provisions in the movie. I guess I can approach that from the other point of view, as somebody who represents survivors and people who've been victimized. I can tell you that in hearing and in some cases reliving with them what has gone on, because the detail with which you have to become immersed when you're representing somebody is daunting. And I think you saw some of that from the former Assistant Attorney General. That's why it's not easy to get folks to do this work. But what we understand is that the most important thing when representing an individual client is to do no harm. And so when I represent an individual who is a survivor of abuse, and they talk to me or somebody else in the room, maybe a parent, maybe a friend, maybe a supporter, says, well, this person has to be stopped. Yes, that's true, this person has to be stopped. This institution has to be stopped. But in a climate of an unfair level of skepticism that we give to survivors of sexual assault and sexual abuse, it's easier said than done. And so what I tell the folks that I represent is that they come first. And if they want to take steps and initiate measures that are related to an interest in helping prevent a perpetrator from attacking someone else, that is fine and good. But there wasn't anybody there to do it for them. So I think we all, whenever we think about sexual assault, sexual abuse, accusations, whether it's on the college campus, whether it's through law enforcement, whether it involves the church or any institution, when we greet accusations with skepticism, I think it's important that that skepticism be fairly measured, that people who are survivors of abuse aren't forced, as they are now, to deal with an unfair, inappropriate level of skepticism, and we see that every day. Perhaps we can talk about some of the details. Thank you so much for inviting me here tonight. It's a delight to be here, and thanks in particular to the work that you've done on behalf of survivors of the church in New Hampshire.
Hi, my name is Dan Barrick. I am now an editor at New Hampshire Public Radio. From 2002 to 2010, I was a editor and reporter at the Concord Monitor, and I was part of the a team of journalists that reported on the scandal as it unfolded in New Hampshire. My role, in some ways, I really feel unqualified to be here. I was obviously a very minor participant in the story in New Hampshire, and was really just following in the wake of some of the really, I think Jim really undersold the really heroic and groundbreaking work that he and Will and the Attorney General at the time did, and obviously what folks who work on behalf of survivors did to really bring their story to the public. And you know, the work Jim described, the year that his office took to get the church to uncover some of his documents, to bring the church to an agreement. But then there was years of work after that to hold church leadership accountable to that agreement. There was further criminal prosecution of the individual priests, and there was a lot of the work done to help the survivors of that abuse come to grips with that, both in the criminal courts and in their personal lives. I would also just echo what Geoff said, just as a journalist. The movie, among the many virtues and strengths of the movie as a piece of storytelling, is just its ability, the truth with which it portrayed the life of a journalist, and especially the unglamorous side of that, and especially the world of journalism of 15 years ago, which in some ways is yesterday and in some ways a lifetime ago. Just, you know, the sort of dogged shoe leather, almost blind grasping. I mean, the Liev Schreiber's quote at the end, we're fumbling around the darkness, and I think that is, 80% of what you're doing as a reporter. And I imagine oftentimes as an attorney, you're trying to find the story, and you don't know who to trust, and you don't know where to look. I'll say one. A lot of folks in the newsroom, when this movie first came to Red River, we decided to see it as a group, editors and reporters. One young reporter, on the way out, we were all very struck by the movie. She said, it was just amazing how they had to report back then, before the internet. Like, they actually had to go to the courthouse and look up the stuff, look at the documents. And I think, if anything, that's that recognition of the craft of journalism and the craft of any kind of just the hard work that it took. And you can tell this story is told through the lens of the reporters, but it could be told through the lens of the attorneys for the victims. It could be told through the lens of the victims. I mean, for anyone involved in this was a very, it's a very clear cut and clear story now, right? And it's very clear who the good guys and the bad guys were. It wasn't then, or at least it wasn't to me. Who to trust? You had the church. You had three very clearly defined clans almost, right? You had the lawyers and the church people and the journalists, and they all represent very different interests, and they all follow their own code, and they all want something very different out of this experience. And one thing that stuck with me, you never really knew who to trust. You wanted something from everyone.
You could trust me.
I trust Will. And I think it's a testament to the hard work of folks like Jim, folks who worked on to help victims come forward and have their voices heard. The clarity that this story, whether it's in New Hampshire or Boston or anywhere now has, it was a lot of work getting there. And I think the movie helps convey that very, very sharply.
As Ray said, my name is Dave Ouellette, and I am a survivor. I really did enjoy this movie, even though, as a survivor, it does set off some triggers. And the triggers just bring back a lot of those memories. Phil, who played in the movie, I do know Phil. I'm part of SNAP, the Survivor Network of Those Abused by Priests, and I'm the leader for the New Hampshire SNAP organization. SNAP is a great family. SNAP has saved me several times. When I was really down in 2010, and I finally decided in 2002, I decided that something had to be done, because as Ray said, I had kids, and I'm driving down 93. I worked for the state. I was going to an appointment, and there was some talk on NHPR, and they were talking about the priest abuse. I almost went off the road. I had pullover, anxiety attacks. And the one comment the person said was, what about the other kids? Are kids going to be safe if you don't come forward? I have 2 young kids. Are my kids going to be safe? Even though we don't go to the Catholic Church. So I decided I was going to do something about it. And finally, after calling the attorney's office and going from one payphone to another payphone, because I didn't want him to know who I was, I really thought I was going to be tracked. And finally, decided to do something about it. Then, I had to tell my wife. Other victims, you gotta tell your wife. And so, I didn't know how to tell my wife. I do remember it was summertime. We were having salmon for dinner. And I just put a brand new tank of gas in. on our barbecue grill, put the salmon on, gave her some paperwork. She goes, "What, you divorcing me?" And we went in, ate dinner, a blank stare. That's all I got for the whole dinner was a blank stare. And then the next day, I went to use the grill, and I forgot to shut the gas off, so I had to go buy some more gas. But then I got to know who Snap was. And Snap really helped me because they were telling me, you know, don't feel ashamed. It's not your fault. You know, I have to tell you, talking with attorneys, you know, a lot of times attorneys, you know, they're just there. It's numbers. We're dealing with numbers. You know, victims, we tell our story. Okay, you know, we have to tell our story. They don't deal with the pain. You know, we go back. I live the pain every single day. There's another survivor in this room that I know very well who lives the pain every single day and who has to deal with the depression, who has to deal with the anxiety, who has children, who has to deal with the up and down mood swings of their father. I also finally got the right therapy. I'm working with a trauma therapist who helps me to understand that it's okay. I'm okay. And I am a survivor. I'm no longer a victim. I need to be a thriver. And I need to make sure that other people understand.
Okay, we're gonna open it. Do we have time for a couple of questions? I'm supposed to ask a question or two, so I'm gonna ask a question, and I'm gonna throw it right back to Dave Ouellette. And the only reason I bring this up, Dave, is because you told this to me for my story, so I figure it's fair game. Can you talk about when you told your two children and how that unfolded?
Right. 2 years ago, my son, you know, I've been working with SNAP since 2010. And 2 years ago, my son found something on my phone, and it's like, "What is this, Dad?" And so, my kids always go to their mother. You know? Always go to their mother. And so, my wife said, "I think you need to explain it to your son." So I took him out. We went to a restaurant. And we had a conversation, and I had to tell him what has been going on in my life. And he looked at me and said, "Dad, I love you no matter what happens. You will be my father. I will always love you." That was 2 years ago. Well, in July, I was getting ready to go to the SNAP conference. And so I pull up a lot of stuff, the itineraries, my airline tickets. Now, I travel for my job. And so when we would go to a SNAP conference, we would just tell the kids, "Oh, I'm going for work." So they always say, "Okay, Dad's going for work." But this time my daughter said, "Hey, can I borrow your iPad?" Oh no, all my stuff is on my iPad. So I run in, I'm deleting everything, deleting as fast as I could. She walks in and she goes, "What are you doing?" "Nothing." She's texting her mom, "I think Dad's having an affair." He's deleting everything on his iPad. So I said, so I get the text, "David, I think it's time to tell." So I told my daughter, who, when I first said, "Do you really want me to tell you what was on the iPad?" And as she did, she goes, "Yes, I do." Like, "Okay, are you sure?" I said, "Yes." And I said, "I'm going to a conference called SNAP, Survivor Network of Those Abused by Priests." Blood ran out of her face, and she just started crying. and crying. And she grabbed me and said, "Dad, why would somebody ever do that to you?" And she and my son have been two of the most amazing supporters I've ever had, where neither one of them felt that they could come tonight because they felt it would be too overwhelming for them. And my son's 20, my daughter's 17. But I got this little note from my son today. "Dad, I am so proud of you. My daughter said to me, 'You are my hero. I love you so much for what you're doing.'"
We'll open it up, let you guys ask questions of the panel.
First of all, thank you all for doing this and for all the work that you've done, for coming forward. I used to work for the diocese. I just want to say that. And I ended in 1992, not really aware of all this going on until it came out. But certainly looking back, there were signs of things like the priests going off and being helped in New Mexico or these centers. Just having said that, the movie is certainly most powerful. I hope it wins the Oscar because something like this should be put in a place that is going to be remembered. And if it's going to be through the movies, then let it be. I was talking to a friend in Toledo. First of all, how it ends with the dioceses and archdioceses and other countries is one of the most powerful things and is a testament to that this can never be forgotten. It should never be forgotten. But I was talking to a friend in Toledo, and the movie is not there. It's been nominated for the Academy Awards. So my question is, and maybe it's something to be researched, why isn't it in Toledo had its problems too, and priests that it was listed in there, and I'm from Toledo. Why is the movie not being out there because of certain reasons? The Boston Archdiocese was pretty strong in their religion and ruling things in the city. Is this still happening? And is this something that would not be out there because in the communities they don't want it? It's just a question.
Can I comment?
Sure.
But I want to.
Well, I just was going to say, I don't know why the movie's not there, but because of Dave Ouellette and the national SNAP leader named David Claussy, who works out of St. Louis, they gave me a tip about someone in the state who was named in the initial investigation, and had been a lawsuit had been filed against him for molesting 3 brothers in Hudson. And he was working at a church, we discovered, again, through Dave Ouellette and the national SNAP leader, Dave Claussy. I found out that he was still working in relation to the Unitarian Church in Charlestown, New Hampshire. And we got him on the phone. My editor helped me with that, John Van Fleet. And he sounded very much like the priest who was speaking to Sasha Pfeiffer. He sounded like him. He just reminded me of him. Very frail, and he was very friendly when we first got on the phone with him. "Oh, hi, what can I do for you?" And then when we started to question him about his past and working in connection with the church, he started to complain that he was hard of hearing, and made the interview really difficult to get confirmation. But anyway, my point here is that I think it is still going on. I think that's one of Dave's big points that he makes working for this organization is that I was really naive to think that Problem solved.
Could I follow up about your comment about the diocese and working there? I don't know the answer at all to why the movie hasn't found more outlets and don't know, but I can describe a little bit about the initial diocesan response in New Hampshire to the Attorney General's investigation in 2002. So right before the time I was actually engaged in working in the case, there was a grand jury subpoena which was issued from our office on behalf of the grand jury to the diocese for documents. Documents relating to its management or mismanagement of clergy. And the diocese's initial response was to object. And they, in court, objected. The issue was litigated thoroughly by their lawyers, literally trying to stop disclosure to investigators at all of any internal diocesan records with regard to how they responded to complaints of clergy sexual abuse. And this isn't ancient times. This is 2001 and 2002. The state was victorious in that litigation effort, and that kind of opens up what was their secret archive. The secret archive is not a term that I created or Will created. That was a diocesan term for the 2 file cabinets which housed, file by file, priest by priest, information about sexually abusive clergy. And so instead of just copying it all for us, because there was probably too much of it to copy, or instead of falling into the trap of being concerned that they weren't giving us everything, once they lost, they knew that the jig was up. And Will and I literally went to the Diocese of Manchester and into what was then Bishop McCormick's office. So he had a secretary sitting in an anteroom, an office inside, and there was a door from his office into a side conference room with a conference room table and 2 locked file cabinets in the back that literally held the documents I'm describing. And Will and I sat there for I don't know how long. I don't know if it was days or weeks. I have a natural tendency to exaggerate, so I'm fearful I am now. But it was a long time. And we would look up and say to each other, oh my goodness. You could tell that the documents were incomplete. There were times where there was a reference to old correspondence, and the old correspondence with regard to a complaint against a priest wasn't in the file. But they were complete enough to establish quite clearly complaints from parishioners and families, parents of victims, to diocesan officials over time, which starts to become the fabric of the prosecution, that the collective knowledge of diocesan management, even if those managers would change personally from year to year and decade to decade, established that the diocese itself knew about a sexually abusive priest and then would put them in a new parish. And then the further thematic that troubled me was when they get reassigned, they kind of consistently get reassigned to more troubled communities, we thought. Holy Rosary in Rochester, the church up in Berlin, Gonick, Keene, towns which tend to be blue collar and harder working, and I think ones where I speculate diocesan management felt a great degree of comfort that they were going to be able to cover their problem priest. And so once that came out, we had the grand jury documents, but the grand jury documents were secured by us under the grand jury subpoena. Grand jury process is secret. And so we were fearful no one would see the documents we were seeing. When we came to the agreement with the Diocese of Manchester, one of the central premises of the agreement was transparency and disclosure. Throughout the process, we ended up compiling over 9,000 pages of investigative material. Some from the secret archive, some from interviews that investigators conducted, drawn from information in the secret archive, some from further grand jury work we did. We would bring priests and other people in front of the grand jury itself. So this group of citizens is sitting there while Will and I are asking questions to these witnesses who have no choice but to be there because of our subpoena. All those records, a part of the agreement, the diocese agreed to make public. So there's certainly people who view that agreement in many different ways, some critical of it, some supportive of it, and some in between. But one thing it accomplished was the disclosure of an incredible amount of documentation to bring light to, if you wish to find them, and you can find them on the internet today, the diocesan knowledge of the events in New Hampshire. And I also believe that individual victims' later lawsuits against the diocese were fortified by the disclosure of the documents that came out in the investigation. So there's a collateral benefit that we didn't get to enjoy as prosecutors, but that occur as victims, we hope, were able to use the information to vindicate their interests in many instances. The diocese, as part of the ultimate agreement, importantly acknowledged that it endangered the welfare of children, which is a crime. It also acquiesced to 5 years of audits conducted by a national accounting firm called KPMG, which conducted audits to make sure that the diocese was living up to its own policies and state law regarding reporting obligations. So I just wanted to kind of summarize the experience to a degree with the diocese and how it ultimately culminated in the revelation of that material to the rest of the world through the product of the agreement.
And to answer your question, I think, Barry, you probably could answer this. There's limited release of movies, and especially with Oscar implications, and then there's a general release, but you could probably answer better than I can.
Well, there was absolutely no pressure put on the theater here to not show the movie. And as far as the distribution of the film, it is being handled by a relatively new company. And perhaps there is some resistance on the part of some chains to deal with that company. That's the only reason that I can think of at this moment in time, as far as film distribution is concerned, that it's not getting into certain areas.
You know, it's probably not an important thing, but on the other hand, how are people going to know about this
Oh, but it
if they
is
don't see
important.
it?
And here's why it's important, because
The fact is that this kind of systemically tolerated abuse occurs when there are imbalances of power and when there is confidence that the story is not going to be told, or that the story is going to be forgotten, or that we can tell a new version. You know, we had an attorney general in Massachusetts named Martha Coakley, who was maligned and chased for the rest of her political career because she successfully prosecuted a daycare provider whose conviction was upheld repeatedly. But then, later on, the Globe and other journalists became enamored with the idea that was advanced by some apologists for perpetrators that, you know, they went after them too hard. And there were problems in this prosecution, and people's rights weren't being respected. But I can tell you, as a daily insider in the system, there is a vast reservoir of sympathy and protection and advocacy for perpetrators in the criminal and civil end of the justice system. And we find that over and over in public life as well. So the way the story gets remembered is for you to discuss it with the people in your life, and for you to read up on it, and for you to maybe get in touch with the Granite State Children's Alliance. Anybody there from Granite State tonight? The Child Advocacy Center in New Hampshire. These cases came to light. I know the Porter case in the nearby Fall River Diocese, near where I worked as a reporter before I practiced law. That happened in the days before we had child advocacy centers, where a child-friendly, clinically based environment where children, that was also affiliated with the Commonwealth in Massachusetts, or the state up here in New Hampshire. And so they could tell their stories. The information could be collected in a manner that's protective of the evidentiary function of the legal system, but then also children and families and survivors could be provided with resources to help out with the clinical end. That's what Granite State Children's Alliance up here in New Hampshire and child advocacy centers throughout the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and throughout the country are doing now. Keep telling the story.
Questions before, yep, anybody up there?
I have two questions, but unfortunately, I think there's only time enough to ask one. While there is litigation, activism, and advocacy on part of people like yourselves, in order to combat these abuses and crimes on part of the church, is there any action on the church's behalf, the Catholic Church in general, or the Vatican, to actually combat this problem that you guys are fighting as well?
I think that the diocese would have to answer that question. At the time we reached our agreement in 2002, it shook somebody up somewhere, because I remember we thought we had this thing all buttoned up, and then they came back to us and said things like, the papal nuncio in DC has got to approve the agreement, and I remember looking at Will and saying, what's a papal nuncio? So I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if someone else does here. I can say that the diocese put together training. They put together an infrastructure in New Hampshire. In order to comply, we understand with the agreement's requirement that it report in real time any new allegation of wrongdoing. It struggled with the audit and fought against it in some litigation at first, even after agreeing, but ultimately did do it, and I mean, has put together a significant infrastructure to report to the state of New Hampshire. And while I haven't been there in years, I've seen some of it, and that is significant compliance to the agreement. It ought to be credited for that, I think. So.
Dave, I think you can address this better than anyone. You were skeptical when I spoke to you, and you were skeptical for good reason, I think.
I am skeptical. First of all, the audits were for 5 years. So 2007, 2008 is when they stopped?
It wasn't actually till 2009.
2009.
Because
They
as Jim
delayed
said,
It took long.
delayed in court, they tried to change the terms of the agreement.
Right, so since 2009, the Catholic Church they don't have to do an audit. So they can go back to their old ways. I also, what was the second part of your question?
Are there any efforts by the Catholic Church in general or the Vatican to combat these these sexual abuses, as well as the efforts brought on by yourselves?
Right. SNAP has found that in many places there is not. It's interesting because the Catholic Church has offered to help support victims by doing prayer meetings for us, with us. Putting us into places where we're not feeling comfortable. And having all types of, we will do some therapy with you at the church, we'll do this. That's not what we need. And whatever the Catholic Church says to me, that what they're working on and how they're trying to resolve it, I want proof. I do not trust a soul because I trusted once. I'm not going to trust again. I don't trust the attorneys. I don't trust the church. I don't trust, believe it or not, Ray. I didn't trust reporters until I met you.
Don't blame you. Don't blame you.
I just wanted to comment on what the church is doing. What they're doing is a program called Protecting God's Children. And I was with the church, and I was teaching some classes with the kids, high school kids. I was teaching with some high school kids, and we had to go to this Protecting God's Children. And it was required if you were going to be around kids in the church. And we had a nun that was presenting, and the first statistic that she brought up was that the priest abuse is such a very small percentage of the sexual abuse that goes on in this country. And I was just blown away. I could not believe that they would try to minimize it, the problem like that. So I think that was it for me.
Right, and I can tell you, the work that I do a lot around anti-bullying, and we put together, I'm in a leadership series, it's called the Hampshire Leadership Series, and there's people who are working around anti-bullying, and so each school district has an anti-bullying policy, okay? You go to the school districts, where's your anti-bullying policy? They're in a beautiful binder, sitting behind the principal's desk. Nobody knows what's going on. So they give you information to make it look good.
Mm.
There's still a lot of bullying going on. There's still bullying going on in the church. But I do want to say, there are some good priests out there. Okay, even though I struggle with the church, there are some really good priests. And I sat down with a priest in November, pretty much told him exactly what I thought of him and his collar. I tend to do that. And when he came back and said, I'm sorry, David. And when he came back and said, you know what, a lot of priests were kept in the dark around this whole church abuse. So there are some good people out there. But there are a lot of bad ones, and a lot more than what people are saying.
We got 5 minutes. This gentleman here in glasses.
I want to thank you all for the panel. It was really informative. I want to thank you all for the panel. It was very informative. And especially like to thank Mr. Duckler. I'm sure he's met with some resistance. At least I'll assume. I mean, some people may think you're opening up some old wounds. I'm not one of them, but I'm sure that. But I just had to speak to the gentleman's comment question, the last one, that to piggyback on what David said. People, I think, fail to make a difference between the hierarchy of the church and the people in the pews. There's still folks who are abused, who are survivors, whose mothers are still Eucharistic ministers in the church. I'm sure it's not easy, but people have to realize, just like what they were saying in the movie, the church does do a lot of good. Catholic Charities does a lot of good. But you know what? That doesn't excuse priest rape. It doesn't excuse the cover-up. Nothing excuses that. Nothing that's done in Africa on behalf of the Vatican, nothing that's done in South America, nothing excuses that. And as far as what are they doing now, well, there is, I guess, from reading Mr. Duckler's article, I think her name is Mary Ellen Piantino, is the one who would, maybe anybody would like to give a call, she could best answer that question. But I do know that from some research I've done, that in 2014, the UN Commission on against torture and against crimes of children, the Vatican State both had to answer for non-compliance, being that they're signatories to both. There's also been a commission established where Cardinal O'Malley is the head of, and there are survivors on the commission from England, from Ireland, not from America, but there are survivors, and it's pretty much he's establishing tribunals, other things, but like David was saying, I mean, the proof of the pudding's in the tasting, and if this were Walmart, if this were, it's just, this would not be going on this long, and there'd be a public outcry, you know. But anyway, I want to thank you all, and I want to thank David, everybody. It's a very important issue that's still, thank you.
Yeah. Can I also say something really quick, because I know we've got to leave. If there are anybody who's been abused, or if you know somebody who's been abused by a Catholic priest, have them go to the local police department. If you know somebody who's hurting or needs some help, if you contact SNAP, you know, you can even contact myself at snapnh@snapnetwork.org. We will get to you, and we will give you information on how you can find a good therapist. And it's a trauma therapist, not just a regular family therapist. You need to go see a trauma therapist. If you go to the SNAP website, my information is there. Because people, you know what, I lived with this for so many years. I'm 53, and the last 4 years have been the most difficult. And it's because I have to deal with it now. Stuff that I should have dealt with when I was a teenager. And my kids have to deal with it, and my wife.
Do we have time? Go.
I have 5 dear friends that are suffering from a few priests. And now my friends are in their 70s and 80s, and they are still suffering from a terrible act by a holy man, so to speak. If you have a child abuser in the streets and they're not a priest, they go to jail. Why don't the priests go to jail too? Get them off the churches, get them off the convents, and believe me, they're in the convents too.
They are. There are a lot
Yes,
of
they're
women.
everywhere that they can be, and there is no stopping them because of the papal authority. Now, don't we have any laws for that? Number one question. Why do they have that carte blanche?
I think we should have a statute of limitation that doesn't expire, first of all.
Like we do in Massachusetts,
Like
or
we
not
do in
doesn't expire, but it's been greatly lengthened.
Jim, you added balance with that when I wrote about it.
There's
another slide.
With the statute of limitations has changed over time. There's an expanded statute of limitations in criminal cases that currently allows a report of sexual abuse to occur up to 22 years from the victim's 18th birthday. Wow. So if a victim suffered abuse at the age of 10, he or she would get all the way to 18 and then have another 22 years to initiate the report for the first time. So it's not a lifetime statute the way there is in homicide cases. Maybe that's appropriate. But there is in New Hampshire what would be considered a pretty progressive statute of limitations comparatively for incidents of sexual wrongdoing occurring in childhood.
Well, I would like to suggest that we have another law, though, and that was any kind of sexual activity in a child or a human being that is not a lawful, like a husband or wife. That should be the first law that they should honor and say, put them in a place where they won't do it again. And number two, I'm thinking, what about the victims? How many victims? I have 5 victims that are dear friends. That's just me. What are they doing for the victims? They have to suffer all their lives. And this one can go around doing it for maybe 20 years, and he's having fun, or it doesn't bother him. He didn't get any excitement from it. So what? Put him away.
Unfortunately,
I have friends that cry and cry and cry because they can't live a human, normal life.
unfortunately, sexual abuse of children as well as sexual assault of people of any age is one of the most underreported, least prosecuted, and then least successfully prosecuted crimes, not only here in New Hampshire, where we did a study about 20 years ago and learned that the cases most likely to be flipped, overturned on appeal, were successful prosecutions of sexual abuse cases, but it's also true in Massachusetts across the country as well. And that's why I began by saying, let's make sure that any skepticism about reports by people who say they have been victimized that the skepticism is normal and appropriate, but not inappropriate. Not this kind of, what was she wearing? Which we are still hearing 40 years later. It's, unfortunately, the rates of abuse, the rates of rape have not changed. Neither have the rates of successful prosecution of those cases anywhere. So we need to look at all of our institutions and figure out whether or not the kinds of power relationships that we admire come out of this kind of a dynamic. Are we actually elevating people who are more likely to be abusers because They are persuasive, they are manipulative, they are able to control, they are able to make you feel bad about what they're doing. That's why a lot of the advocacy organizations now are talking a lot about narcissists within personal relationships and are saying, if you have a relationship with a narcissist, take a look at whether or not you're at risk. Because one of the things that we do know, one of the things that was as true for your friends in their 70s as it is today, is that you are far more likely to be victimized by somebody that you know, respect, trust, and love than by anybody else. The rapist stranger in the parking garage in the trench coat that's been used to great effect in political campaigns is in fact almost non-existent compared to the numbers of people who are victimized by, in the most egregious of betrayals, by those that they know and trust. So we've all got to be ready to answer some hard questions, and that's why it's so wonderful to see so many people out here tonight on a freezing cold night willing to talk about these issues, because we don't want to talk about them, we don't want to look at them.
Does Jim have?
I wanted to say something about the case, because there's a thematic about the case we're discussing that didn't get addressed, which is why in the Catholic Church, certainly sexual abuse occurs in all religions, in all faiths, in all different types of relationships. Why did this spike in the Catholic Church? And I think that there's something we didn't touch on yet. As we did the investigation, we tried to understand a couple of things, because we were looking back historically about how, what the response was as in law and in society to reports of allegations over time. That response was different in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So we had some help from a person who is in the therapeutic world to help us understand what a typical response would have been. So we didn't blame necessarily a failure to respond in the 50s the same way we would today, because it's changed culturally, it's changed legally. Another thing that's critical to understand is that why in the church, why in this church, canon law instructs that the church avoid institutional scandal. One of the central teachings of canon law, as it relates to this particular scandal, was to avoid public notoriety, avoid scandal, avoid trouble. So as an official position of canon law, church hierarchy was acting that out and suppressing it as occurred. Next, why in this church still? Part of it was a convergence of events in canon law and avoidance of scandal. But my personal theory, and maybe this isn't right, and I've heard this elsewhere, is that there was a point in certain Catholic families where the youngest son in a family, as a matter of pride in the 40s and 50s and 60s, would go to pre-seminary at the age of 13, 14, 15 years old and begin a chaste life then. At the point where the rest of us are having our first typical sexual experiences with people of the same or opposite sex, these boys in pre-seminary were too, but with one another. And so as they grow into adulthood as priests, they're kept immature in that sexual acting out. And when they do so, they relate back to the time period they're comfortable with, in the age of the boys they're comfortable with. And over again, what we were finding were victims who were 13, 14, 15 years old. That same age base. Now today, it's not a matter of pride in a Catholic family for a kid that age to go to pre-seminary. It almost never happens at all. And so the bell curve of those incidents of sexual assaults hasn't stopped. It never will. It will occur in frightening fashion forever, and we must be vigilant, as just described, in rooting it out and prosecuting it and supporting victims. But the bell curve has subsided substantially. So I think the convergence, a coalescence of events between a canon law shrouded in secrecy and an odd system of chastity imposed upon people who didn't ask for it at a very young age caused this unique issue to surface in this church at the time. That's a theory that I've heard and think might be...
You know, the only connection I can really see, based on the research that I've seen between celibacy and abuse, is the culture of secrecy as they described in the movie. And I thought they did a very good job of that whole, this whole culture of secrecy, making it fairly easy for people to transfer that secrecy onto the situations involving abuse. Yeah.
Thank you.